Wow, we are rocking today. Welcome everybody to the Ben and Ryan Show. I am your host, one of your hosts, Ryan Brown, and with me, my Arnold to my Danny DeVito, Mr. Ben Nadel, my
Howdy.
co-host, my partner in crime. I've made you Arnold. I didn't take that. So, and joining us today, we have Shawn Gorrell. Shawn, welcome. He is and I'm going to make sure I get this right, hopefully, the Director of Innovation and Agility for the Atlanta Fed. So,
Sure.
Amazing title. I think we all wish we could be the Director of Innovation and Agility for a company. So, congratulations on that. And he has his master's in Industrial and Organizational Psychology. So, he is big time. So, we're very pleased to welcome him to our show. So, Shawn, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Today, we're going to talk a lot about AI. So this is a topic that Ben and I, in various shows, we've touched on. And so Shawn's done a lot of thought on this, on implementation with teams on this, discussions on this, on how to kind of best use AI, not only in a development environment, but even just in your workplace in general. So we're going to touch on a lot of topics. So, Shawn, do you want to kind of open us up kind of with some of your general thoughts on AI and where it's going and how people can use it? And then we'll just run from there.
Oh, wow. That's the big question, right? Well, so I'm one of those ones. So I know that there's a lot of people out there who kind of are alarmist about it. There's the whole spectrum, right? The people who are like early adopters and this is going to be life-changing. And then there's the people that are freaked out. Like I'm somewhere in the middle of that. I think of it like kind of any other tool and like what I'm able to get out of it to make my life easier, to make the people that I work with easier. But when I got really kind of more interested in this, probably around 2019, but where I was coming from was from the point of view of like ethics versus usage, right? But I was kind of ahead of the curve. So this was pre-Chat GPT. So generative AI and large language models weren't really a thing at that time. And so that was back, I hear people calling it vintage AI. But kind of where I was coming from at that point in time was really unpacking all the different technologies that were kind of under that umbrella. And then considering it from a use and abuse case, like what are the things that we can get out of it societally or as a team? And then what are the costs or the risks to those kind of things? So that was where I got really interested in it. And I think the reason why that I had that level of interest is on some level, I felt for a while is that we don't necessarily have the ethical framework in place for the technology we had 20 years ago, let alone what we have today. And so that's when I started to kind of go into it. But now, like I have access to use these kind of things, it's like, okay, how can I use these things to get better? And so, as a developer, as a manager, as a worker, actually in my own life, but so using the tools kind of like that.
Okay, very interesting. So, when we were talking before we hit record here, we were talking about one of the use cases you mentioned, and it's something that Ben and I have not touched on at all. And so I wanted to also start on that side of things. So in Ben and I's discussions, we've talked about how it does code completion for you. It can find bugs, but you had another take on it for something that's an irritant to all developers is unit testing.
Yeah, and I know there's some vendors out there that there's, and I haven't got a chance to test any of these yet, but to where they're using it for generating automated unit testing. And I mean, test-driven development and test-first development is one of those things. It's like the holy grail, right? It's starting with the test case and then, developing code that makes the test case pass. But I mean, if anybody that's really done it there's a lot of discipline that's involved. It's tedious. I mean, it's one of those kind of tedious things that we do. And so I'm kind of intrigued with how can we get to more people that are doing that because they've got tools to enable them. And I'm not 100% confident that they're going to be great at like your more complicated kind of unit test. But if they can get you towards, if they get you solid enough stubs that you can do the rest of the way, I mean, that's kind of a big deal because testing is one of those things that's nobody I don't want to say nobody, but most people don't really seem to love writing unit tests. Automated unit tests, and sometimes they don't even necessarily grasp why and how to do that.
Yeah.
So for those listening, you said you haven't used any, but do you know of any of the AI unit test writers that people could take a look at and examine on their own?
Man, I should have been ready for this question. I know that, so I probably got 50 emails in my work inbox from vendors that I shunt off by rule to my external folder, because I'm constantly being hit with those kind of things. But since I'm not really I'm not in a development role anymore. I'm not a part of like project selection. So most of the things that I'm actually getting my hands on are things that have interest in around, IO psychology or personal health stuff. So like a thing I did with my GPT over the weekend was I wanted to see how well did it do, because we think of it as large language models and you're like, okay, it's really good at those kind of things, but I wanted to see how well did it do with ingesting data for analysis and writing code to do it. So what I ended up doing was I got all my health data from my blood pressure monitor. I got all my health data from my Oura Ring, and I said, okay, what can you do with this, basically? So I put it in, I uploaded it, and then asked it for what kind of insights could it get from the data. And actually, my prompts were better than that, because prompts are pretty important. So my prompts were sharper than that. But it came out with some really great insights. But then I'm like, okay, let's see how well it can do at something harder. And I said, all of the insights that you just gave me, can you give me the code for that in R? Because I prefer to use R for doing data analysis. And I said, give me the code in R that does all the stuff that you just told me. And it did it. It did it. And I kept going farther and farther down the rabbit hole with it. And it's doing this like inferential statistics. It's doing predictive modeling. Like, it's doing a really good job.
Interesting.
And so I'm like, okay. And so you hear all the stuff about that large language models can often be liars and they'll make stuff up. So I'm like, okay, I want to know, can I take this stuff straight away from the model and load it up in my R Studio and run it? And it did. It all worked. The only thing, like, I had to make one tweak around pathing, so the pathing to my data set. But I think it was really just like, had my environment been configured in a certain way, it would have just worked. So I think it assumed how the environment, our environment would be set up. But I took all the output of ChatGPT, created R scripts from it with my data sets in there, and it did it. And it was all the same. It was all right. Like, all the code was right. And I mean, I didn't have to really fix anything. And that was kind of surprising, because you do hear the stories about people like cranking out kind of crappy code. But in the times that I've used it, it's been pretty solid. But that's predicated on is you have to know how to ask. Like, you need to have, like, prompts or everything. You have to know how to ask. But also you've got to have enough domain knowledge around, like, in this case, the domains of statistics, graduate level statistics for psychology, and use of a tool like R as a programming language. So, because you've got to be able to go and validate those kind of things rather than just trusting the output of it.
Yeah, I love that. So I'll say, because I've been asked before, and actually I had a conversation earlier today with somebody about, hey, have you used AI to analyze data before? And I've thrown out some test financial data to have it look for certain anomalies, and it was terrible. It was not complete. I knew of ones I was looking for, and I could look at it and tell it that was it, and it was not included in its set of data it returned back to me. So I never thought of asking it to then write some sort of a validation script in R or any language of your choice to validate, or to kind of do that analysis in an outside tool to kind of validate that. I think that's a great idea, because then you could use that method, and any other data you could just put into that other tool, as opposed to having to go back to ChatGPT to have it do.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I don't really, honestly, I treat it in some level like it's an intern or it's a graduate research assistant or something. It's one of those, yeah, it's helpful, but really you need to make sure and validate it. One of the things that I noticed about it too is that there were some places where it chose some libraries that I might not have, like I would have chosen different. But I mean, it's like in R and Python, there's so many awesome libraries out there, and it comes down to preference. So it picked some ones that I was like, oh, I haven't seen that one before, or I would have done this instead. But the output was still still worked and was still valid, but it gave you that opportunity to go and check and say, hey, what it said here, did it really say that when you run it through R? And it did.
Well, this is where I feel like I start to have an emotional disconnect with the usage because so a lot of people say that you shouldn't be emotionally attached to your code. And I just feel like I'm not wired that way. I do feel like I am very attached to my code. I have a lot of preferences about how I like to write things and how I like to evolve things over time and discover new patterns, etc. And I don't quite yet know how to have it generate code and then not just want to rewrite all of the code that it gives me into my particular approach. You have to some degree, give up. Not give up's not the right word, but like you have to release yourself from the burden of having to have full control over every aspect of it and just give in to the idea that it's there trying to help you. And I have not been able to really take that leap of faith yet.
Yeah, I'll bet. So do you struggle with using low code, no code stuff too, where you're like, you're not in the weeds enough to feel connected to it?
Yeah, I don't have a lot of experience with the low code, no code stuff, but even when I'm asking ChatGPT for technical solutions, which I'm not really good at yet, but for example, the other day I was trying to mess with Cloudflare's R2. It's their S3 compatible storage, and they use the S3 version 4 signature generation to make sure that the URL isn't tampered with. And it's like a weirdly in-depth, complicated process for multiple nested hashing, where it's like you hash something and then that becomes the key for the next hash, which becomes the key for the next hash. And I had it give me, I said, what's some Cold Fusion code to output the signature generation? And it gave me code, and I didn't even bother running it because I just wanted to copy and paste it and then completely rewrite it. And then ironically, there was a bug in my implementation, and it took me like 6 hours to figure out where the bug was, which I don't know if the bug existed in the original implementation, but it's that just drive to like, I have to have my hands, my sort of take on what the code should look like.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to slow me down.
Craftsman.
I mean, I think that's a generous take on it. I think maybe I'm limiting myself. So you could say that I'm a craftsman, but I'm also stubborn, and that's, not as shiny a light. But if we can just take one step back for a second, I am curious about these custom chat GPTs. So I've only really used go to chat.openai.com and you start typing into the box. As far as creating a custom chat GPT, what is that experience like? Is it basically just kind of prepend this prompt to everything that you send to this chat GPT, or is there some more in-depth understanding of what the customization is?
Yeah, so it's somewhere in between. And I know there's other people that are like doing because I'm using so I'm on the plus version of it, and you can create your own custom ones. And essentially what you're doing is kind of giving it a persona, and there's, it's a certain amount of configuration around it. It's not very complicated, but they end up in what I'll do to, you can test it against just this out of the box ones to see like the differences. Mm-hmm. So like the one that I use all the time is my transformative insights that, so it's essentially, trained towards or configured to be an IO psychology consultant. And so it kind of responds that way. And as you add your content to it, it like I've noticed that it's different over time of the kind of stuff. So I've used, uploaded like all of my research and stuff from school and those kind of things. It becomes kind of different over time.
Yeah. And Ben, the other thing with the custom GPTs is that Shawn kind of glanced over there is that you can not only pre-prompt it, but you can pre-prompt it with files. So let's say you want to, I think you and I have chatted a second about this, but you could have your own style of coding in a like a Word document that you described, and you could load that into your custom GPT, and that way every time it output data, it would reference that file to then produce the output code to you.
Right. Gotcha. It's kind of cool. It ends up being kind of, so the reason why I even did mine to begin with is because I wanted it to be reflective. So I was in my graduate program for IO Psych, and one of the key things about it was, I guess, a feature of the program was everything was really centered in diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? So that was an underpinning like theme or thread in the program. And I wanted to make sure that my GPT kind of reflected that, because that's kind of the point of view that I was coming from. And I wanted to make sure that it reflected it versus just a regular, kind of response.
Can you give us the elevator pitch on what IO psychology is?
Oh yeah. So that my shortest version, when people ask what that's about, is it's about making work suck less.
Let's do that.
In IO, again, to remind everybody, industrial organizational.
Industrial and organizational. Yeah. So they used to be kind of two different things. But if you go back to the origins of it, like it goes really far back. If you go back to the stuff like the Hawthorne studies and like Frederick Taylor, the time motion studies, things like that. But so there's a very long body of research around how people work and how people experience work. But so it's all based on, and there's some people that if you ask them about, well, what IO psychology is about, they'll say it's about job analysis, which is true. That's one of the facets. But like where I'm coming at it from is using empirical and research-based methods to make things better for people at work. Make people more productive, make people more engaged. One of the things that I'm super like kind of fixated on is how can we reach the point where the fewest number of people on Sunday night have trouble sleeping because they've got that pit in their stomach about going to work on Monday. I'm like, how, and I know we're not going to get to zero. We're not going to get to where nobody feels that way. But I'm like, how do we get to the fewest number of people that just absolutely hate the idea of going to work?
I was listening to an interview just the other day, and I feel like this overlaps with what you're talking about. And the guy was saying that people's default position is that they want to do work that is good. Nobody wakes up and says, oh, I want to go into the office for 8 hours and do substandard, mediocre work. Like everybody really wants to do a good job, and we have to embrace that. And he said, when you think about work that way, we often think about how can you add something to make life better? But oftentimes, if you phrase it as people want to do good work, but they're not able to, it can help you think about what can we take away? Like, what are the things that are stopping people from doing the good work that they innately want to do? And I don't know. I just thought that was very, it's just nice to look at things from different perspectives so you can see different paths forward.
Yeah, what you just described there is just people positivity 101 is that belief that people are, their default is coming from a place of good versus a place of idiocy or incompetency or negativity. Yeah. And having that, I mean, I think that's a really kind of important mindset to have. I didn't always used to have it earlier, like developer, I worked with the software, as early developer version of me. Are we able to say any bad words on here? Did you leave them out?
You're good.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's fine.
I like to refer to myself as a recovering asshole.
That's not even a bad word. You're fine.
Yeah. But like you might meet some people in the cold fusion community that remember me from, 15, 20 years ago when I was a little bit jerky, a little bit like sure of myself. But yeah, like kinder, gentler version of me is more focused on, is that I do believe that people genuinely want to like do the best work, come from a good place. And how can we get rid of those kind of systems and things, those barriers to them being their best?
So how did you make that transition then from the old Shawn to the new Shawn?
Oh man. It's been a progression.
there are many people who are in the old Shawn that could listen to this and benefit. I'm not going to name names, but
I think what it really started for me, and this is going to sound kind of silly, it's this was, when was it? It was when I was turning 40. So I was turning 40. I was getting ready to turn 40, and I was a bit of a fat pie. And so I decided, okay, I'm going to lose weight, right? And so I joined a fitness boot camp, so Operation Boot Camp in Atlanta. And I'm like, I'm going to get myself in shape. And so when I was on that journey, I connected up with other campers, and there was something about the environment of like helping and supporting other people that I don't know, it is. And I know it's really kind of, it seems silly to say that it took me to 40 years old to figure out that you can get good benefit from helping other people and helping other people reach their goals. But so I'm a couple of months into my journey, and the instructors from the program were like, "Hey, we think you'd be a really good instructor. Would you come and do it?" And I'm like, talk back to me when I hit my goal weight. When I hit to the point, I'm like, let's talk again when I reach my own goal. But then I ended up doing that, and so I did it for a couple of years until I ended up moving. But yeah, it was just one of those things that I was like, wow, there is this thing about helping other people reach their goals gives you something. And I mean, I should have known that a lot earlier, but like that was really the beginning of the journey, and recognizing like in the career space too, that, I mean, a lot of times we're always focused on our outputs and our outcomes and our careers and our desires. But I think a lot of times is that we miss how much you get out of helping other people meet their goals. It's only accelerated as now that I'm like hella old. Like, so I'm 55, and I'd say that I'm in the eldership phase of my career. Is like, I'm not focused on what my next promotion is. I'm not focused on like the next thing. I'm like, okay, how do I build a better place for the people who are coming up? Because that like STEM and programming, it's not always the best environment for everyone. Like there's plenty of jerks. It's not always great for women. It's not always great for people of color. And I'm like, how can we make a better world for the people that are coming up behind us so that they don't have the same kind of struggles, that they can be their best selves, and they don't figure those things out when they're 40.
Yeah, absolutely. I find that just as I get older and I experience more of the world and more of the people, it just changes the way that you think about things. You're young, everything is about you.
Yeah. So what would to kind of getting into your philosophy on making work suck less, what would you recommend for people if they feel like they're in the Shawn of old, I'm an asshole type phase? What should they just join a weight loss program? Or I mean, probably not a bad idea but kind of what would you recommend to help them out, kind of get out of that funk?
So I work with teams a lot. So I was like start from that place. And so one of the things that we do a bit is team chartering or setting up of team operating systems or team working agreements. One of the thing that I notice about working when you see teams is where they run into struggles is when you have the stuff that's kind of below the waterline that people don't see. Like, and so what you try to do is make those implicit things explicit. And like, so how do we like to work together? So if you've got a team that's a mix of introverts and extroverts, is really getting people to say, okay, here's what I need for me to be my best in this environment, and asking those kind of questions and really coming to, a collective agreement about how do we work together. And so like a thing on my team is since I've been a remote for so long, I don't have the same kind of like time boundaries that people in the office do. It wouldn't be uncommon for me to do something on nights or weekends, that kind of thing. But you have to, the people that you're working with, you have to be really clear to say, hey, just because I'm crazy about my schedule doesn't mean that you have to be too. So if I send that email at 10 o'clock on a Saturday night, please don't touch it. Like, just ignore me. It's just me being me. But like those things, like really just having the conversation and making sure that you kind of create a team agreement around this is how we work together to be our best. Like that's a place to start. I've got a LinkedIn post that's about it. It's really kind of around. So you're going to work together on a thing. Talk about it. Like, and somebody asked me that, like, what would be, what's the smallest team that you would charter? And I'm like, two people, because if you're going to work on a thing together, it's like, okay, so what are we doing? Why are we doing it? What does good look like? What does done look like? If we get off track, what are we going to do about it? Those kind of things, just being able to understand the intention that people are bringing it. Like if we were going to partner, like you two partnering on a podcast, you might have completely different reasons. Like you might have a completely different why of that you're doing this. And that's okay. But if you aren't aware of those like underpinning whys, that's where conflict arises. Because when you don't understand what someone else's intention is.
Well, the fact that you're a remote worker and I'm also a remote worker, and one of the things that drives me absolutely batty is when people talk about, oh, the benefit of being in the office is that you get that random interaction at the water cooler. You can have all those insights. And I always, I'm listening to my podcast and I'm screaming like, that's not a feature. That's a bug. Like if you were just explicit about how your team needs to communicate and how you want to prepare for meetings and how you want to gather feedback, you could have all of those insights in probably a much more efficient way. You shouldn't have to rely on people randomly running into each other in the hallway in order to get these moments of synergy. It's crazy to me.
Yeah, when you hit the key thing in there, is about intentionality. Is like really, I think a lot of, and I had to really kind of change how I rolled, because so pre-pandemic, I used to go back in the office once or twice a month. But so I was traveling quite a bit. Post-pandemic, I'm in like quarterly. But before the pandemic, we were in the office basically 4 days a week. The people that were in the office, now we're at 2. And so when I started traveling back to the office after the pandemic, I operated very similarly to how I did before, and recognized just how horrible that was. It's like I was going in and I was sitting in a cubicle or a team room on Teams calls all day, and not really making the most out of the time there. And so, but after about 2 trips, I'm like, this sucks. And I hated it. I'm like, this is such a waste of my time. And so, but I had to change myself, because so I'm an introvert. So I do enjoy being remote. I do enjoy like my own time and I like my own work. But what I had to recognize is when I'm in there, since people are only in there 2 days, I had to make the most out of my human time. Mm-hmm. And so what I would end up doing is, and I still did this, is I'll block off time on my meeting schedule and go down and sit in a public space. Like we have high tops in our cafeteria, and I'll work. But my whole intention there is bumping into people and seeing people and letting them know, hey, I'm here and I want you to interrupt me. And that goes against my introvert brain, but I recognize that I had to change how I roll to be more effective, to be more engaged with it. Because if you're going to be there and you're going to make people go back in, you need to make the most of it. And if everybody's being crammed back in there and they're spending 8 hours a day on Teams calls, why are you not doing that?
You might as well just be at home.
Be at home. But how can you be intentional and maximize, get the most out of your together time?
So now, from the organization side of things, it's interesting, and our takes are completely different. Being the opposite on the extrovert side of things, I did spend time where I was full-time working at home, and I was like, I hated it. I'm like, I need to be connected to people. The just doing Teams calls, or at the time it was Skype calls. This was years ago, and I was like, I just can't do this. I need that people time. So, and I have had the time where I've been in the office and I've run into somebody, and it's something I'd meant to ask them. I just hadn't had a chance to send an email, and that reminded me, oh, Tim, I've been wanting to ask you this. I just completely forgot. Let me now ask you that question. Is there a way to do that? Oh, why am I all fuzzy now?
It's like you're fading away.
Beaming out. I was like, oh no. I don't know what's going on now. But how, because I look at it, I'm like, I'd love to have that interaction in the office. Being also in marketing, I kind of make the connection, the correlation of you send out marketing emails, not necessarily because the person, wow, it's gonna be an interesting podcast. Hopefully I'll stay here.
It's really cool. It's like some sort of sci-fi thing.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on.
Are you beaming into a different dimension?
I don't know.
Slowly?
I don't know. Here, let me try covering this. See if I come back normal. I heard that's a true. No, it's
That's awesome.
So we're really just I don't know. Yeah, I have no idea.
I'll say I'm very much introverted, and I enjoy working remotely. When I was younger, I very much loved being in an office. When I was young, I'd go out after work. I'd have dinner with people. We'd have communal lunches on Fridays. We'd order hot wings. I mean, there is very much a beautiful thing about working in a co-located space with people and just having human connection. I don't mean to dismiss any of that to say that there are benefits to working remotely, but I've become the guy who's like I chit chat with the cashier at the store. Like that's where I try to get a lot of my human interaction these days. Because especially this past year, as my team we've basically had a bare bones team, and it hasn't had a lot of that kind of sense of community. So I find myself trying to get it elsewhere, and it's not as easy when you're not in an office.
Younger version of me, like I just didn't want people to talk to me, basically, like out in the world, those kind of little interactions you're describing. But I do think that like the pandemic, somewhere between the pandemic and also just, life changes and stuff, that I've started to do kind of a bit more of that. But what I try to, I guess the thing that has been changing for me is like being able to ask better questions. Cause I really, I think most introverts hate small talk. Like
100%.
that stuff about sports ball and all the kind of things like that is like that's a death. That's a death for introverts. But so like finding ways to ask those kind of deeper questions about people, like that's where like wanting to find out more of them versus like what happened on the football field this weekend. That's how I can kind of like bridge that. But yeah, I used to be the one that like I'd go to conferences and stuff, and I would do all the conference like the sessions, but I would never do any of that the evening stuff, the socials, the extracurriculars. But when I became a people leader, I kind of recognized career wise, it's really important to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's really important to do that for your career. So you kind of have to suck it up as an introvert. But something I learned in my IO psychology program that it might help you, Ben, as an introvert is so there's the concept of shallow and deep acting, and the cost of emotional labor of those things. So when you're in a situation where you're working against your natural style, your natural engagement style, how you deal with that, it's through acting. Basically. So let's say you as an introvert, you're a customer service representative, and you have to engage with people in a happy way that may not really fit with you. And it just absolutely wears you out. So what you're doing at that is you're putting on this face, but that's called shallow acting. But so deep acting is when you find the point where you actually recognize what's the benefit of that for me. It's like you find really finding your why. And so that's what I did with like conferences and that networking stuff. Is I'm like, oh, if I ask better questions, I'm going to find out really interesting things about people. And like, that's what I take. It's still tiring, like it's still fatiguing to a degree, but much, much less so because you're actually getting a benefit from it versus just putting on the face.
Yeah. I look at it like a practice. When I'm out, I get to practice my people skills. And so for that, it's like I'm building a skill. I'm making a skill better. And I try to find ways to make that enjoyable and not so draining. And I know when I go to conferences, I treat the sessions as an escape. It's like I can do my people stuff. And then as a break, I can actually now go and watch a presentation and not have to deal with anybody for 45 minutes. But then I'll go and I'll be with people. And I try to I try to do that thing where if you're in a little small circle of people and someone's sort of standing near you, you kind of step back and you try to open up the breadth of the circle and pull them in. Like, oh, come join our conversation. Like, how can I become a connector? Which is very much not my nature, but it's like in that moment I can say, how do I build this community? How do I pull these people in? How do I make it less awkward for them? Because it's super awkward for me, but in the sense of service, it becomes less awkward by making it less awkward for others.
So you figured it out. That's the deep acting.
But it is exhausting. And then I get back to my room and I'm like,
I think so that what's really important. So I like that you refer to it as a skill, because people skill, like I think there's a lot of times that people think we throw around the term soft skills. I prefer people skills or I lost the thought. But so there's another way of referring to those. But that's the kind of stuff in this age of like AI and language, like all this stuff that's coming. Those are the kind of things that it's not going to be able to do. Right. So if you can have the generators that make like, code better than a human, you have to think about what are the things that you can add to yourself skill wise that it cannot replace. Like those human things, empathy, emotional intelligence, like there's stuff that cannot be replaced by the machine.
Yeah.
And that's the stuff, and that's the kind of conversations like I have. So one of the coolest parts of my job is I steward our internship program. I've been doing that for 8 years. But one of the things that I really try to emphasize with, because they're all like undergrads, a couple of grads sometimes, but just to get them to start building their people skills earlier on in their career, because there's a lot of times that, and you know this from dealing with developers, is that isn't always something that we're the best at, but that ends up being that thing that's such a differentiator, you know, because and a lot of times there's like the most skilled technical people aren't always the best like people. And so that's a thing. So I tell my interns, because they're all like, I'm getting the best and the brightest. I'm like, the thing that's going to differentiate you is how you are as a human being. How do you treat other people? How do you work in teams? I'm like, because if you're the smartest person in the room, but you're a jerk and nobody wants to work with you, you're not going to be long for this world. So I'm like, the thing that really levels you up, it's people skills.
I wholeheartedly agree. And I think when you have good people skills, especially in a technology job, it just allows you to think about problems much more holistically, because you're not just running down a to-do list of tasks that have to get done. You can have a conversation. You can reach out to people who weren't in that conversation to get more background and more insight into what's going on. And it really just enables you to think more deeply about the problem at hand, which I think always ends up with a better solution.
Yeah, I was another thing I focus on with my interns, because, and this is something like I'm trying to teach them all the things that took me a really long time to learn, because I used to, as a programmer, I loved writing code, and I still love writing code. But what I tell them is that as software engineers, like, we're not in the business of writing code. We're in the business of delivering business value and solving business problems. And that's why I like low code, no code so much. It's because really it's the shortest distance between a business problem and a business solution. Younger version of me would have been like, I would have turned up my nose at all this stuff. I mean, and you probably, like, you've been around the community long enough, when we used to have to write, like, when we were hand coding reports versus something like a Power BI tableau. Like that was the old school programming, was like, we didn't even have reporting engines at that point. But so, I mean, I remember the version of me that would have really looked down on somebody using a tool like that, going, oh, you should just write code. And now the version of me now is like, yeah, use the tool that's going to get to business value faster and write the least amount of code.
I hear you. I'm definitely in a transitional period in my life in that respect, because I think part of me still holds on to the notion that for long-term maintainability of something, I want to have a deeper understanding of how it's been implemented. But sometimes the faster thing that's delivering the value to customers is the right way. And I'm having trouble reconciling those two things right now. That's where I'm at. And the introduction of all the large language models into our industry is so nascent that I feel like we haven't discovered the long-term pros and cons quite yet, because we just haven't had enough time.
Yeah, I have some fears there too. So one of the things that you kind of touched on is I do have worries about people losing like the underlying skill. And I always advise my interns, I'm like, yeah, use these tools, get the most out of them, but learn programming. So learn Python, learn R, learn C, like learn the languages and learn how to do the code. Do not lose those skills. Do not rely on the things to generate for you, because I mean they're not always going to solve the problem. Because I'll give you an example. It's like we were doing a thing in Power Automate, and there was connectors in there for the Azure cognitive services. So there's out-of-the-box connectors that are in there. But what we ended up finding is that their implementation of the connector really didn't expose the richness of the underlying API. And so what we ended up having to do is writing an Azure function in C# that really got at the richness of the API that Microsoft hadn't in the connector in Power Automate. So, but that just doesn't come up quite as often. But I think you've got to hold on to those skills and not just rely on the machine. Figure out that mix there.
That's what makes me nervous when I hear people talk about the way they're approaching it, and they'll say something to the effect of, I just prompt it and it gives me a whole bunch of stuff and I run it and there's errors, and then I tell it about the errors, then it fixes the errors and I accept that, and then I run it again and there's new errors and then I have it fix the errors. And it's like so many red flags in the back of my mind, because I'm like, you have no idea what's actually happening. And I'm sure that they do. That's a very broad brush to paint with there, but it just feels like you're moving around in the dark looking for the door, and that doesn't feel like how will you react to edge cases later or extenuating circumstances or when you need to change this code. It just feels weird.
Now, Shawn, have you had the GPT kind of act as the prompt for you? So to give you an example, in Ben's case, so if he's looking for the bug, instead of having to necessarily pass it to the ChatGPT and have it iterate through that, have it prompt you to say, hey, what should I look for to try and find my bug? And have it encourage you to, okay, look for this. Okay, try this and let this. And then that way you're learning from it. I just watched a masterclass on ChatGPT, and I had never thought about going in that direction for it to help me on something. And it's like, yeah, it's to say, ChatGPT, go into critical thinking mode. I want you to help me think through this. How should I find this? It wasn't a coding question, but in this case, how would I find the bug? And that could be something you try, Ben. First of all, is just kind of to help you get into it, and that way you don't lose stuff. You still understand it because it's helping you to figure out how to understand it.
Yeah, I think that's such a legitimate concern, though, Ben, about like people losing the skill and relying on the machine. And so when I took critical analysis 1 and 2 in my grad program, so it was with R, but one of the things that they really essentially forced on you in the curriculum is you had to learn the underlying statistical methods.
Yeah.
And it was rough. Like, it was rough. You couldn't just...
Statistics is hard.
Yeah. It is. It's hard. Like, statistics is hard. But so they, rather than just being like, hey, here's a thing, do it in R, is like they actually gave you like all the real math to do those things. And you were being evaluated against that. So it wasn't just what you can do in R. It's you had to understand the statistics as well. But I think that's going to be that's the challenge, is we're going to have to hold on to that underlying knowledge, or we're going to have a bunch of people who can just like run prompts, and you don't know how good the output's going to be.
Sometimes this is going to sound like a silly statement. Sometimes I feel like Einstein really ruined it for people, because he had some famous quote about, why would I memorize something I could look up in a book? But he's also thinking about relativity and space-time distortion. Like, he's operating on such a high level. For you to take something that he said, or for one to take something that he said and try to apply it to your life and how you approach work, I feel like you're comparing apples and oranges. But I do feel like there is obviously there's only so much you can hold in your head. But I think the more you can hold in your head, and the more you practice at holding things in your head, the more connections you can make across different little idea bubbles. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I'm out walking the dog and I have some random thought pop into my head that's based on something I've been working and struggling at trying to solve. And I fear that when we all become prompt engineers, that what's the moment of insight that you're going to have in the shower? Is it going to be, I could have reworded that differently? I don't know. It just feels like something feels like it's going to be missing.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally get that. I think though that, as a person who's getting older, like I used to be able to hold everything in my head. Mm-hmm. It's funny. I was talking to one of my interns yesterday about this. It's like, 20 years ago, I didn't have to take notes in meetings. Like, I didn't have to take notes at all, because I've got a really solid memory, and I could go, there's a time when I could take conversations from years ago and replay it like verbatim in my head, who said what, when, kind of thing, how I felt, what the room was like, that kind of stuff. But as I've gotten older,
yeah, no, I know.
I definitely, it seems like there's less kind of working space in there. And so I tend to be much more of a note taker and those kind of things. So I think you've got to figure out how to, and this, like going back to the Einstein quote, it's like any of those kind of ideas is figuring out how that might work for you. Does that work for you or not?
Mm-hmm.
Right. It's kind of like the, all models are wrong, but some are useful.
Yeah.
I think a lot of times people try really hard and they say, well, Steve Jobs did this and he was that. So if I did that, then I will be this. And it's like, no, that isn't how it works. But, and that's one of the things, like, and this predates my whole thing, my interest in psychology, is really understanding essentially like life hacking and growth hacking and things like that, and how that using those things to make your life better. But what's interesting is like what works for you amazing, this year or this month, over time, it becomes less and less effective. And you either throw it away and replace it with something else, or you retrench, like you go back and kind of recommit to a given practice.
Yeah.
I don't know if you notice that, like, because I'm going to imagine that both of you guys have things like those little things that kind of keep you on track, right? Your productivity stuff, your little things that keep life operating, that kind of run like background processes,
right?
That kind of stuff.
Well, Ben, let me throw a question out to you. Now, what are your thoughts on frameworks? Because frameworks were kind of, okay, frameworks exist, but you could also do the underlying code and write the stuff yourself, or use this framework. Is that different than using a GPT to help you write the code? Because you're not understanding it. You're leveraging someone else's code.
It feels different. I don't know if I can articulate why. I think when you're using a framework, so I use frameworks, but then I also just write code without frameworks as well. I like to do it both ways. There's different, you can achieve more sophisticated solutions when you're building on top of more robust frameworks. But it still feels like you are understanding the foundational mechanics of what's going on. As long as you don't lose touch with the foundations, I think that's the red flag for me, is when people just lose touch with what's actually happening. And it's not like you have to understand everything. When I start the car, I've got no idea what's going on, and I've never changed a flat tire, probably never will. Like I got a guy who will fix my car when it breaks, and I'm totally fine with that. But it's not my profession. If an application that I'm working on breaks, I have to know how to fix it. And there's a different level of dedication that I want to have to the understanding from top to bottom of what's going on. And even that is too much to ask in today's world. There's parts of systems that are so specialized and complex. I don't, if the team that's working on it leaves, that's a problem, because I don't know how to do any of that stuff. And maybe that would be a place where, okay, in the past, I would just, we'd have to hire someone, but maybe with ChatGPT, it'd be much more feasible to now train someone up to then go and work on that internally, or, train myself up, because now I have such a wealth, an embarrassment of information that I can query now for approaches to problems. So I'm not poo-pooing the large language models. I think that they're hugely valuable. I get nervous when I hear people say such extreme things like, it'll reduce the cost of software development by 90%. I've heard that from people who are like very, very bright people. And that makes me super nervous. But then they're so bright, I feel like maybe I'm an idiot and I just don't understand, or I just don't see it yet. But that just feels too optimistic.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. I think that is a little bit optimistic. But I think you have to think about like where is that applied? If you look at like most business applications, it's pretty repetitive, like it's rote stuff, right? And so there's a lot of that stuff that I think could be easily automated with generators and stuff like that. It's the specialized places that no way, like it's just not going to. But something in there about like the difference between the frameworks. One of the things that that I think is different is like if you look at, say, like a programming framework, you've got access to the source code. So you can get in there and you can actually see it and understand, like really deeply understand. And even if you just use it, like maybe you never change it, maybe you never extend it, but at least it's visible to you. It's transparent to you. You can get in there and it may be complicated, but it's understandable. My thing with models is like a lot of times, like they're not. What's behind the curtain kind of thing. So they're not necessarily as transparent. They're not necessarily as explainable. And I guess that's where I see the difference between like that and frameworks.
Well, and not to go off on a tangent here, but you were talking about getting into AI back in 2018 era, which was before the large language models were public. But back then, there was certainly a lot of public controversy about things like facial recognition, about things like, which bank customers are approved for loans. And, there's all kinds of racial disparities there. But because these things are such black boxes, you can't say, why did this guy get rejected for a loan, but this guy got approved? And because it's a machine, we're not liable. But they are coming out, from what I've heard, or I don't know if this is actually going to happen, but there are talks about mandates around like above a certain level of sophistication for LLMs. They want to be able to have insight available so that if it's doing these mission critical things, legally you'll have to be able to say, and this is why it happened. But I don't think the technology is there yet.
Well, I think hiring decisions would be something that would be scrutinized, because there's all the laws around hiring and what you can and cannot do on that. And if you pass off that to a GPT or a large language model in general, then you're running into some of the ethics around it. It's like, is there anything in that model that's gonna not hire certain people that are protected classes?
Yeah, it's already happened, and that's it. I'll have to share with y'all. I've got a video out there and a presentation deck around my ethics in AI and automation. But that kind of stuff, there's already been pretty. Amazon did some experimentation with using that in their selection process. And really what they ended up finding out is they'd essentially codified bias at scale to hire certain types of people. And so they quickly abandoned it. But there's been, if you look at, like Ben, you brought up facial recognition. If you look, and I'd had, when I did my presentation a couple of years ago, at that time, 100% of the false identifications with facial recognition in terms of like identifying people as criminal or bad actors, were incorrect, were people of color. 100%, right? That's crazy, 100%. Right? And if you look at look at the data around with the experimentation with predictive policing, predictive policing is really, really problematic because part of it is because there's no such thing as crime data, right? What there is reported. I saw the look, Ryan, as you're like, what? What do you mean there's no crime data? There's reported crime data.
Right.
So ponder that for a minute. And so one of the things that they do know is that certain demographic groups report crime, particularly property crimes, at lower rates. And it's because, like, if you're affluent, are you going to be reporting broken windows types of events? No, you're not going to. So, and there's plenty of data that proves that. But what in predictive policing, if you just use reported crime data, essentially it's this self-reinforcing cycle of going after certain communities because that's where crime is being reported.
Well, Florida, not to hate on Florida for a second, but Florida is like a perfect example of this because I think they were the first or one of the only states where all of their crime records are publicly accessible. So that's why there's all this, quote unquote, Florida man fun times. You Google stuff, Google your birthday and Florida man, and it brings up some crazy, police arrest man for feeding python ecstasy. And like, you think, oh, people in Florida are batshit crazy. You're like, no, people everywhere are batshit crazy. It just happens that all of those crimes are publicly available in Florida records. And so it becomes this sort of, humorously self-fulfilling prophecy. But that's if you take that and now determine who can get bank loans. I mean, it's one thing to have a ha funny Florida people are crazy. It's another to say, no, you can't buy property. That's very dangerous all of a sudden.
Yeah, and that's the kind of stuff that got me kind of interested in the ethical aspect of it. Is because I mean, there's plenty of great use cases, but like, okay, what are the abuse cases? What are the ways that this could actually harm people? I mean, and even getting to simple things like A/B testing. A/B test. So LinkedIn did a thing. They did an experiment a couple of years ago around. And with the experiment that they were doing was essentially they wanted to understand the power of weak ties in connections. But what they were doing was, and they didn't tell anyone. They didn't tell anyone they were doing this, but they were essentially experimenting with what job openings they showed to people on there. But so and what they really could do there, if you think, okay, what's the potential harm of that? Because you're like, that doesn't sound like such a bad thing. But if you've got somebody that's been out of work for 6 or 8 months, you don't want an algorithm, A/B testing you that may prevent you from seeing a job that you actually could land. And when, kind of confronted around it, they were like, well, this is in our user acceptance, like, that little box you checked when you signed up said that you can do that. So, but they never like bothered to have informed consent around that particular experiment, which they could have it's not too hard to present that to people and say, give them a choice to opt in or opt out of that. That's not a very difficult thing for them to do, but they just like buried it under, oh yeah, it's in the terms of service. We can do whatever we want. And there's a lot of this stuff that's like, if you think through like, any of those things like A/B testing to when they show you, different products, you might like this. If you unpack that stuff, there's some ethical questions in that are worth examining. Like that's where it really got me, is like, because you can use this kind of stuff to essentially manipulate people into doing things that they may not otherwise do.
Well, what's so fascinating is you come from the world of psychology, and when we do psychological experiments, these things are very heavily, I don't know if regulated is the right word, but there's a lot of stuff where they talk about things that were done in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, like the prison experiment and the electric shock experiment. You're like, we could never do those things today because you're giving people trauma, and that's the risks outweigh the benefits. But if you do the same thing in the confines of a technology app, suddenly there's no regulation. Nobody cares.
Right. Well, yeah, they're not subject. And that was something that was interesting when that was one of the very first modules that we had in my grad program was around that. And it was kind of interesting where it applies and where it doesn't. So in an academic setting, like if I'm going to do research on human subjects, that ends up having to go through an IRB. So in internal research, what is it? It's called an IRB, but it's essentially they review the research, your research plan to see could it potentially harm people, and are they willing to take the risk to do so? But for like a technology provider like a Facebook, a LinkedIn, or something like that, none of those rules apply. Right. They can do whatever they want on the platform, and that kind of stuff. If you look at like the algorithmic manipulation, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, it's kind of that's one of the things that kind of a thing that prompted me away from most social media. And so I'm on LinkedIn and Mastodon basically. So I'm off all the others because, I mean, what I want to see on there is like the things that I follow in a chronological order.
Right.
That's it. That's how right. I mean, I don't care that like this is a high engagement thing. Like, do not manipulate me towards a thing. Right. Just give me the things that I follow in the order that they happen. And that's all I want to see. But like, that's a little bit too much to ask for these days.
Yeah, no one's doing that.
Yeah. I was listening to an interview the other day. I don't remember which podcast it was. And they were saying that it was the algorithmic feed that really broke all of social media. That before that, exactly what you're saying, it was just a chronological list of the things that you cared about.
Yeah, can you even order it that way anymore? Because on LinkedIn, I think they've got it. You can order it by recent. I still don't necessarily trust that. But what I find is like when I set it to recent, it always will like, within a couple of hours, it switched back to top.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I didn't ask you to do that. But it's like, oh no, the algorithm knows what you need.
I mean, as a poster on LinkedIn, I definitely see people reacting to posts from weeks ago.
Yeah.
And it's because it just now showed up in their feed. And it's just interesting to figure out why why things do show up in their feed in certain times. Shawn, I got a question for you. So being someone who is into AI and believes that there's a benefit there, and if you're instructing a manager who's a development manager, and he had a Ben on your team, how would who likes it but is kind of resistant to AI? And not that there's anything wrong with either of those approaches, but how would you help that manager and someone who's resistant to the change kind of work through that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I would focus on the business benefit, right? What's the business benefit to it? And really, so not just that, or what's the team benefit from it? And this, I mean, that's kind of change management 101, is starting with what is the thing that you're going to get out of it. It's going to give you more time to do this or less time to, like, so maybe you've got a tool that you end up doing way less yak shaving, the horrible, tedious things that we hate to do, is focus on what are those kind of things. It's, which that's a way, I mean, I kind of look at those tools in the same way that I look at like my focus on making, the IO psych stuff is how can we do things that make life suck less or work suck less? Because, I mean, as developers, and I'm sure you're familiar with yak shaving as a term, is that like, how can you, those tedious little soul sucking things that we all have to do, like writing unit test cases, except like how that be the focus is like, what are the things that make a developer's life better, and prioritize that, and things towards business benefit too.
So I think listeners out there who do manage teams is something to kind of start with is looking at, okay, hey, what sucks that you can want to not start doing, and if you can pass that off to some AI to do some of that.
Yeah, that's what I mean, and that's a thing you could do in an exercise with a team. Something I used to do when I was had architecture and QA is about once a year, so we'd get together and the prompt was this: it's if you were the benevolent dictator of IT, what are we not doing anymore? Right? What are we not doing? Like, what are we going to quit doing? And looking for opportunities, and then seeing from that, okay, what are things that we could really quit doing? Because most of the time, I think that's one of the best things you can do for anyone is take away a thing that hurts.
Yeah,
Shawn, I think I saw this slide in one of your presentations where it gave like things that you should be doing, the things that are important, and it was a grid.
The Eisenhower quadrant.
So what's the grid? It's important and like urgent.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, it's a 4-box prioritization from I should do something about this right now to don't do that. But I mean, I like that. And the Eisenhower quad, I mean, it's one. I mean, there's other prioritization models out there, but it's a very useful way of thinking. I'm a model person. Like any of those kind of mental models or heuristics to help me do a thing.
So those things that are not urgent and not important, you know what? Those could be offloaded to some AI, or even into the unimportant things. Okay, hey, if these are really unimportant, how can I have either my junior dev, aka my GPT, do this for me?
Yeah, well, it's the same thing. If you look at like what people have tried to do with digital process automation, robotic process automation, is you target those things, those tedious, repetitive stuff. So like things that you can apply rules engines to, like approval of travel vouchers and things like that. That, I mean, how many of those processes are business users dealing with that you've got a person that has to go through here and check the accuracy of a thing, and then make some kind of determination of accept or reject that could very easily be described in like rules. Like those are the things. And that's the stuff that kind of work, it's just soul sucking, right? Like that's the kind of stuff that I like to target. Like, how can we, this horrible thing that you have to do regularly, how can we get rid of that?
Yeah, there's a comic that I saw on Facebook or somewhere, and someone said, I don't want the robots to do all the creative stuff so that I have time to do laundry.
Yeah.
I want it to do the laundry so I have time to do the creative stuff.
Right. Oh my God. So I've got a Samsung washer that's like powered by AI. It sucks so bad. It sucks so bad. I'm just like, it's not powered by AI. For one, I'm like, you're lying, and two, this is terrible. But yeah, I saw that same thing, Ben, and that's one that you're right. And I was just playing around with Sora, that video generator, and I thought it was terrible.
Not good.
I thought so. What I wanted was, have you ever seen the thing from Microsoft that's like the ninja cat riding a shark?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of an iconic Microsoft swag that you can get from Build or Ignite. So I'm like, and so I gave a Sora prompt. I'm like, I want a ninja cat riding a shark, and it was just horrible, absolutely horrible. But, I do have that kind of similar fear around people using it to replace, like if you look at the image generators like Dolly and stuff like that. Like one of the prompts I gave it was, give me pictures of cats in the style of Wes Anderson films. But I mean, I don't want to replace, like, creative people, like they get love and joy out of doing those things besides being compensated for it. But yeah, focus the machines on doing horrible things that we all hate to do, things that are unsafe, things that are boring, things that are repetitive, things that are tedious, versus having like writing poetry.
I mean, even on the creative front, doing if you do the same sort of quadrant that you mentioned, the stuff that the graphic designers hate doing, like, hey, I need this graphic for a LinkedIn post. And you're like, really? I'm working on this major website change, and you want me to stop so I can make you a graphic so you can do a LinkedIn post that may or may not get 100 looks. Like, why am I doing this? So to kind of pass that off to, because I use that. Like, LinkedIn posts, if you don't have a graphic or a video or something, they get much less views. So including that, I'm like, all right, if I need something, I can just hit ChatGPT, and if it's decent, I'll use. What's unfortunate is I see people using graphics from ChatGPT that are not good. That they ask you to, like, ChatGPT is terrible at putting words in places.
Yeah,
really bad at words.
It's a terrible speller.
Yeah, and I'll see people using the graphics straight from that, and I'm like, okay, I appreciate the time savings, but okay, just tell it not to do that, or there's actually editing tools to make those changes, to spend a few minutes.
I don't know why it's such a terrible speller. One of the places that I'm seeing it used, I'm going to make a guess, is like, because I don't know, but I see a lot of LinkedIn posts. Like, so LinkedIn over the last year or so, there's been much more of this emergence of like influencer types. But if you look at a lot of the content, you're like, man, you're getting that from Gemini or ChatGPT. Like, there's so much that they're just churning. It's like this content churn, like creation factory, that that they're not writing it, because there's all the telltale signs in like how it speaks. That's the kind of stuff that bugs me. And I think it probably lands with you, Ben, as a person who's a blogger, is like one of the things, like, part of like the love of being a blogger is your own idiosyncratic like way of writing.
Yeah, like, your soul in the writing, you know.
Yeah. I overuse the comma. I love commas. Like, I
love commas. I love semicolons.
But I don't want something to correct me. And I don't want something to take away like the soul of my writing and stuff like that. But yeah, I can really see it being used a lot. And I think, but it's those people who are like trying to monetize their online presence versus, I'm just blogging because I love blogging.
It feels really weird to me that LinkedIn now has these shorts and reels equivalents. It feels out of place. It feels like now the influencers are in the LinkedIn world, which I'm like, don't you have your Instagrams?
I don't care for it.
It's generally around business coaching or self-help.
Yeah.
Along those lines, and not to take out Gary Vee or anything like that, but they're all trying to be the next Gary Vee or any Grant Cardone, all those guys. They're trying to be the next
and
one.
They're trying to shortcut. They're basically trying to shortcut it, because I mean, I get it, as everybody wants to say, okay, how can I monetize a side hustle or thing? Like, everybody wants to. They have the dream of like, not like, how can I, in the shortest distance, to financial independence and retire early, kind of thing. Right. I don't know. I mean, I think, Ben, that you and I are probably similar in that if when there's that financial component to it, it makes me fall out of love with it. So it's like photography. So I went to photography school years ago, and I did one gig where I was an event photographer at a thing at the Georgia Aquarium. And that whole like pressure, and I hated it. I hated every minute of that. I love taking travel pics, and I love doing my own stuff for my own purposes. But once there's like, once there's a financial thing or that kind of pressure like that, I don't want to do it anymore. I kind of do it for me.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I have the job that pays me money, and then I have the things that I do for fun.
Yeah. And don't take it away, Chad.
Should we start to wrap it up?
We've been chatting for a while. We've touched on a bunch of topics from all around AI, but the ethics of things, organizational psychology. So it's been very interesting. So Shawn, thank you very much for joining us.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's fun. I appreciate y'all reaching out, because I recognize like I haven't been. I'm old in the cold fusion community, but I haven't been around as much. But I always I think that the cold fusion community has always been a great place. Right? Agreed. I loved it. Lots of great people. Much more so than other programming languages that I've done. Is CF has always had this kind of like, it feels like a community versus a whole bunch of people, And
I think what Ben and I bring to the community is not necessarily, we're not taking the place of like Charlie Earhart's information. Like he's definitely he's doing these presentations. It's all about the coding and that sort of thing, or the server side of things. I do another podcast through my Real Job Expedite Cloud that we do stuff like that. But Ben and I are just different takes. Like we'll bring in people like Shawn. We didn't talk about CF at all, and we're just interesting discussion, and not always. There's not an agenda out there. We're just we're three people talking about stuff and whatever comes up in our conversation, and hopefully people like to listen into our discussions and our thoughts and our tangents and all of that. So it's fun to kind of do this, to be the different side of things, and to bring in people who are I guess just kind of tangent to cold fusion, I should say. Speaking of tangents,
we just want to have a good conversation.
Yeah, but Shawn, you're welcome to. Maybe we'll find other topics to chat with throughout the year. Bring you on to kind of the psychology piece and the IO side of things is not something that normally the community chats about. So it's good to kind of have those discussions.
Yeah, I'd love to come back and we can talk about bartending journeys.
Bartending journeys. All right, he's teased it. We're coming back. All right, well, everyone, thank you very much. For Ben, myself, for Shawn, thank you guys for watching, for listening. We will advise you to listen to this one, not really watch it, because I mean, you put your hand over me because I was all fizzly to this. We'll look into that. But we made it work. So thank you guys for listening for the hour 15-10. And stay tuned to the next one. And next time we have Shawn. So everyone, thank you very much. Cheers.
Cheers.